from Rome and we've landed in Singapore, which is one of the most ultra-modern cities in the world. So here's where we're going to concentrate on modern cityscapes as opposed to those ancient Roman cityscapes. Anyone who knows me or follows me on social media knows that Singapore is one of my favorite cities in the world. So when I was thinking about places where we could film the first urban landscape, the first cityscape portions of this video, Singapore came up right away. I really wouldn't want to go anywhere else. I first came to Singapore at the beginning of 2012, and since then I've fallen in love with this type of architecture. I'm standing in the core of the Marina Bay area, and you can walk around the entire man-made basin and find beautiful reflective shots of the skyscrapers and different extraordinary pieces of architecture in Singapore. So no matter how many times I visit, I always find new things to photograph or see the old things to photograph in new and unique ways. The great thing about Singapore is it's 100% safe, it's clean, there's amazing, beautiful vantage points, and there's very few restrictions on tripod access. There's a lot of public areas that you can access, and there's so many great things to see and do and photograph that it makes it a really great place to visit and either capture really beautiful photography right out of the gate or spend time learning and perfecting that cityscape photography, because literally almost every access point is available to you. When we were in Italy, we were able to go to different locations and really cover that coastal ancient architecture with the water and also the Roman architecture, that urban sprawl of old buildings. But it was a little bit different because nothing we shot was ever very tall, and nothing was made of glass and concrete like it is here. My goal with Singapore is to work on the knowledge that we've also gained by shooting in Italy, but take it that step further and apply that same knowledge to modern cityscapes. Everything's going to be a little bit taller, everything's going to be a completely different color palette, and we're going to have to sort of start over in some ways with the way that we compose the shots, but we're going to be able to use a lot of the skills that we've already acquired in the other shooting locations to help make really beautiful shots. In Singapore, the skyline usually falls over a body of water, and in this case it's going to be around the Marina Bay Basin, which is really nice. So it gives us an opportunity to get these really tall buildings with a flat line of them sort of rising up against, and also get the opposing reflections underneath. So in Rome, like I said, sort of to sum it up, I like to stay right in the center of it, with landscape photography right in the center of it. But with cityscape, sometimes, especially if you're waking up early in the morning for those AM blue hour and sunrise shots, it makes more sense to stay outside of the city center so you can be close to the area and the views you're going to capture. In Singapore, we're basically on the equator, so the time of day doesn't really change or fluctuate that much as we move through the year. It's going to fluctuate a little bit, but for the most part, sunrise is around 7, sunsets around 7 p.m. We're in the dead of winter right now and it's like 90 degrees, makes it very comfortable. But it's really nice because you can get a consistent sort of wake up time and a consistent start time where you can always start a few hours early and a few hours early on the other side, and you don't have to get up tremendously early in order to capture it. So what you'll probably notice right now that the cityscape behind me looks quite hazy. Well, that's for a couple reasons. One, we're here late in the afternoon, so the sun's actually going to set behind those towers, so it's creating a lot of sun haze. The other thing is, we're in the heart of tropical Southeast Asia, and this part of the world tends to suffer from an environmental haze. Singapore has a much cleaner atmosphere than most of the surrounding countries, but it still can be an issue. So we don't really get that crisp, colorful tropical blue that we would in, say, like the Bahamas and other tropical environments. We actually get a soft, hazy blue. So the environment can change from day to day and sometimes even hour to hour. So right now we're in here in the afternoon, and I always like to get here a few hours early so I can walk around without any of my camera gear or just with my Fuji X-T1, the very light gear load, and I can walk around and sort of test the compositions. Now obviously I don't do much shooting with the sun right behind the buildings and this washed out light. I like to get everything set in place, figure out all the shots that I'm going to work on, whether that's in a trip that's going to be 1 or 2 days or 1 or 2 weeks. I like to get all that scouting done at these lighting times when I'm not wasting time scouting when I could be shooting. Because once we lock everything in, then I can easily go back with my gear, set everything up, know exactly what I want, and capture the good lighting scenarios. Now, when I am scouting things in the late afternoon, it's easy to visualize the composition, but it takes a little bit of extra effort to visualize what it's going to look like at this beautiful blue hour that I'm waiting for. And one thing that we can't see right now, if we were to look at the way that the buildings reflect on the water, is we don't see any lights from the building and how they're going to interact with the composition. So it takes a little bit of foresight and just a little bit of faith to figure out how it's going to look, but at least you can lock in the compositions. Later, when we actually pick and settle on a location to shoot tonight, we'll be able to see how those reflections change when the lights turn on and it fills out those compositions. So really, just try to use a little bit of foresight and imagine what it's going to look like in those nice lighting situations. So throughout this video, we've kind of learned that while we call it blue hour, it might not necessarily be an actual hour. So here in Singapore, on the equator, sometimes it can be a blue 10 minutes. So it's important to be set up and ready to go for that lighting scenario. That's one of the main reasons why I spend so much time scouting. So let's get started. Let's start scouting some of the areas around the Marina Bay and pick the location that we're gonna use for the blue hour shot. So this afternoon, I'm going to be capturing one of the more iconic cityscapes in Singapore. Behind me is the Central Business District. We're in the Marina Bay area, which is a beautiful man-made water sanctuary that you can walk all the way around. The first shot that I really want to do is showcase the marina skyline, in this case, the Central Business District. So I've been scouting for about the last 30 minutes, walking around the circumference of this Marina Bay area. I started out on the Double Helix Bridge shooting towards the skyline that you see behind me now. Let's take a look at the progression as I moved from viewing platform to viewing platform. So as you can see with these shots, the focus really is the Art and Science Museum, the big flower building that you see there, sort of in front of the cityscape. And this first shot, you can see it's the main attraction. But if I move on to the next shots, as I move along this bridge across to the other side, stopping on each platform, you see how the cityscape starts to spread out to the right a little bit, and then I have the flower as an element with the cityscape. Then you can see by the time I get all the way near the end of the bridge, now I have almost the entire skyline and the flower building. But I really don't want to work on these shots yet. I just want that iconic skyline without the flower building. Now, these shots on the bridge are really beautiful too, and they warrant time to explore. If I have more time, I may come back and shoot these at the blue hour as well. Just something to note, if you are here standing on the Helix Bridge, if you stand just for a few minutes, you'll notice how much it vibrates as people walk by, and it has another bridge next to it where traffic goes, so you actually get this big wobble. So anytime you're shooting at night, you kind of have to time your shots between that wobble so your frames don't end up blurry. Singapore is really special because it's tiny. I mean, we're really looking at all of the main towers in the Central Business District all at once. Other cities are going to be a massive urban sprawl where there's no way to get everything in one single frame. So sometimes you're going to have to exclude certain portions and capture just a little bit of the iconic landscape, or in some cases, the most iconic portion of the landscape. Here we're lucky because we can get nearly everything in one frame. So once I got off the bridge, I started moving towards the skyline, and I took a couple reference shots on the way when I was still pretty far away. So let's take a look at those. These look pretty good, and on any day, I might come back and shoot these as well. But I wanted to see what it looked like when I got closer to that skyline, if I could change the perspective. Because what I didn't like far away is we have the main structure of all the buildings, and then off to the left, we have these few towers that are kind of satellite towers away from the main cityscape. I know that when I get closer to the main part of the cityscape in this bridge, I know that I'm going to start condensing it because the parallax will change, which means that all the buildings will start to become more clustered together, and those few towers that are off to the left will start to move a little bit and condense to the right, so I'll get a grouped cluster of buildings. I settled on a 3/4 perspective looking down the bridge because I wanted to use this bridge as a leading line into the city, and I knew the closer I got to that bridge, the more predominant that bridge would become in the frame, and would actually cause the bridge to become bigger as I move closer to it, and smaller and less significant as I move further away. Let's quickly take a look at a few of those now. So as you can see here, I'm pretty far away from the bridge, so it looks like the bridge is just part of the skyline, just continues away from it. But as I start to get closer and I move towards something like this, you can see now the bridge starts to become more of a predominant element. And if I get too close, you can see the bridge gets even more like this frame here. So I settled on somewhere right in the middle. Now bear in mind, there is no wrong answer here. You might like something with the bridge not so significant further away. I like to be right in the middle. Somebody might want to be actually on the bridge. There's no wrong answer here. This is just artistic license and whatever you feel is going to make the shot that you want. As you can see, the lights are starting to turn on. I'm starting to see those really nice reflections in the water. We're also really lucky in Singapore because we have all of these reflections to work with. So imagine that we were just looking at a concrete slab with buildings coming out on it and no reflection at all. We just have a bunch of towers and a flat ground with nothing interesting in the foreground. Here, I know that the reflections are going to cause a counterportion to the composition and add a lot of interest to the frame overall. I'm specifically here to capture the blue hour, and that's going to be very similar to some of the shots that we've already worked through, so I don't have to overly explain what the blue hour is. In cityscape photography, it's great because we have all the lights on and we still get a natural blue color from the ambient light in the sky. Now, I'd say 5 or 6 years ago when we talked about night photography was always black skies. Remember seeing those iconic cityscapes where all the lights are yellow and we're on solid black. A few years ago, when the camera technology started getting a little bit better, we started to be able to work in the blue hours because we were able to pick out those subtle nuances of color. So now for me, night photography is really synonymous with blue hour photography. And now the real night photography is when we're talking about night sky and Milky Way and all those cosmic elements that we can now capture with the camera sensors. So for me, night photography, night cityscapes, nightscapes in general will always be focused around the blue hour because in my opinion, it's the most beautiful time to capture these lights. Let me explain my setup a little bit here. I have a 2-camera setup. Both cameras are shooting at the equivalent of a 16-35. It's a Nikon 16-35. It's the Fujifilm 10-24 at 35 crop is basically a 16-35. These are the lenses that I like to use scouting cityscapes because very often, and most often in these cases, I'm going to be shooting wide to medium depending on how far away I am from the city. The other thing that I'm doing here with a 2-camera setup is I've locked the position of the Nikon camera. That one's just going to shoot 5 bracketed exposures as the light progresses, so I know that I've picked the composition that I really like and I can find the perfect lighting scenario with the blue hour and then choose the one to work on in post. The Fujifilm X-T1 I'm using as a floating camera, and the reason I call it a floating camera is I'm starting out with a similar composition to the first camera, but as the night progresses I'm going to try different compositions because I set all this up and scouted it before the lights came on. And even though I know Singapore and I know cityscape photography, I may have missed little details because I couldn't see them. I had to visualize what everything was going to look like, but sometimes when you actually get to that lighting event, it changes more than you actually think. So I have the other camera set up here just in case I want to make changes to the composition based on how the lights are turning out. Talking very specifically about the composition that we're looking at, you'll notice that I've angled the camera up a little bit. And that's because I don't like to have my horizon centered in nearly any of the photographs that I capture. But this comes at a clear disadvantage. When we're working with landscapes and mountains and even a lot of the stuff in Rome, when I tilted the camera up a little bit, it didn't really change the distortion because we're not dealing with long, tall, linear objects. If at a wide angle, you go up 2/3, so you have 1/3 water and 2/3 sky, the buildings are going to be so distorted that while you can control and correct those linear lines and make them parallel in post, that much bending of the image is going to cause additional distortion. I like to go up maybe 15–20% so I have 60% sky and buildings and maybe 40% water, so that when I correct in post, which I'm going to cover with you guys, I'm not going to create any additional distortion from that bending of the pixels. Another thing that I like to do is I shoot 1 or 2 millimeters wider than I anticipate the shot that I want. The reason being, when I stretch out those pixels again, I'm going to lose some of the surrounding area. I'm going to have to crop down a little bit tighter. So I anticipate that usually being about 1 or 2 millimeter difference post-cropping on the image. I've explained the camera setup, but let me talk a little bit about the settings now. So I'm shooting at a very low ISO on both cameras. I'm shooting at f8 on both cameras. We've discussed the reasons why I do that. It's a sweet spot with nearly all the lenses and you're going to get perfectly sharp images throughout. It's important with your cityscapes that everything is sharp. All the buildings have razor edges on them and that way everything's pristine in post. Now remember I said that the blue hour can happen really fast. We don't have a lot of time. Everything looks really good, really beautiful. I think it's the perfect blend. The lights are coming on. I don't have any dark shadows. The sky's a beautiful blue. So I'm going to make sure that I get these shots as soon as I can and really focus on the next few minutes. On some of the shots that we worked on before, you guys have seen me shoot through the entire sequence of time and then take multiple pieces of that and blend all that time together into a single shot because I may have wanted the color from the sky with the lights from the foreground. In this scene, I'm only concerned about getting the perfect blue hour. So I'm shooting every minute or two so that I can capture the perfect moment in time that I want to keep. Now, sometimes I may think standing here that it's the perfect moment, but later on when I get into post, I may have missed something. So I like to come a little bit before and stay a little bit after so I capture all the way through what I think is the best lighting situation so that I can choose the best one in post, the one that has the best balance of the light. One thing to note about these types of lights on the buildings, and you can see all the skyscrapers behind me are actually heavily branded. It's all these logos, all these neon signs on the tops of the buildings. These actually cause the dynamic range to be quite extensive. So if you were to shoot this with a single exposure, you'd get a pretty nice cityscape. The buildings would look good, but if you looked at those lights, they'd be completely blown out. I usually settle on 5 exposure brackets, so that's 2 under and 2 over. Sometimes when it starts to get really late and even more dark, I have to go down even further. So I'll take that 5 exposure brackets and I'll EV shift it down. So instead of 2 under, I'm getting 3 under and 1 over. So the most important thing is as you're bracketing, make sure that you're capturing all of the lights. Zoom into the little logos, to the little windows, and really make sure that you're not blowing anything out before you settle on your shot. So now the lighting event is over. The blue hour is over and is now too dark. Now, how do I know it's too dark aside from the fact that it's too dark? Well, the sky turned completely black. The reflections are washed out. And if I look at the reference frames that I've taken, everything seems to be extreme. So it's extreme highlights on the buildings and the lights, extreme shadows, and a black sky behind. Where a few minutes earlier, actually 15 minutes earlier, when we were at the peak of the blue hour, I still had enough ambient light to bring everything out. So I didn't have harsh shadows and super high highlights. I had everything just perfect and balanced. This type of nighttime photography, black sky photography, can still be pretty nice. You can get some really dramatic images. So I don't want to discourage anybody from shooting at this time, but for my portfolio, I really like to have the perfect blue hour shots. If you do wait and start to get some dark sky shots and you have a lot of clouds, another good indication that the blue hour is starting to end is that the cityscape actually will light the clouds. So you actually get the reflected light from the lights on the clouds. So when the clouds before were these nice, beautiful blue colors over a blue sky, they'll start to look a little bit yellow or pink or whatever that low glow of the city is causing them to capture on themselves. So I really love this vantage point. I think that I captured a really beautiful blue hour, but things can change quite a bit from the PM blue hour to the AM blue hour. So right now you can see that it's still kind of business time in Singapore. Everybody's gone home. Some people live in those towers. All the lights are on. People are still in their offices, and there's tons of branded neon logos all over the buildings. If I come back in the morning blue hour, we're gonna have way less lights on in the buildings because people are asleep. People aren't at work. There's also a shutoff point for a lot of the lights in the city to save power. Usually after midnight, some of the street lights go off, some of the building lights go off. So the morning blue hour is gonna look completely different. And it might actually look better or it might actually look worse. I know that I'm guaranteed to have more lights if I come for a PM blue hour than I will for an AM blue hour. However, something else that typically changes in the morning is the water. Now this is a basin, so it's the boats that are causing all the ripples. So in the morning, there are no boats and the water had a chance to calm down. So I think if we come back here in the morning, although there's going to be less lights in the buildings, we might have a better reflection. The other thing I know, and the big difference about shooting this time of night as opposed to tomorrow morning, is the sunset back there behind the towers. Tomorrow it's going to rise, and as it rises, it's going to illuminate these towers, so it's going to have a completely different feel than this shot does. So tomorrow morning we're going to come back here to the exact same spot and see how much different it looks, so we can show you guys the difference between the PM blue hour in these buildings and the AM blue hour. So it's 8 p.m. on the dot. It looks like the beautiful Marina Bay Sands laser show has just begun. Another really great thing about Singapore is the food, so now it's time to go get dinner and enjoy the show. back in the same location we were last night. We woke up at 5:30 so we could be here all set up at 6 o'clock. Sunrise is about 7:10. I always like to give myself about an hour to make sure everything's fine. Usually things take a little bit longer in the morning because I haven't had as much coffee as I've had in the afternoon. It's still fully dark outside, so it's going to be another 15 minutes before the early blue hour starts to begin. So right off the bat, there's some big key differences from last night. So the first big difference is the reflections are much more calm than they were last night. There's very little disturbance on the water, so with an exposure time of just a few seconds, it almost softens out the reflections completely, which is really nice. Another big key difference, and I expressed this earlier, the lights are completely different in that most of the building lights are actually off. Unfortunately, here with Singapore, they seem to leave a lot of the branding logos up. I think I've lost about 40% of the logos, and a lot of the buildings, the taller towers on the right, I've lost the exterior lights. So being here this early, I'm in a situation where the towers are sort of lost in that dark background because they're mostly dark themselves. So as the sun starts to come up and the sky turns a little bit more blue, I'm hoping that we'll still see those chiseled edges on the buildings themselves. So right now, I really like the reflections. I'm not so happy about the difference in the lighting on the towers. And to be completely honest, this morning, it's much more hazy, so the clarity is down as well compared to last night. Now, I'm pretty confident that last night's shot's gonna be a much nicer blue hour, but I could be wrong. We're in a tropical climate. Things can change rather rapidly, so I'm not just gonna pack it up and go home. I'm gonna stay here since I've already gotten up early, shoot through the blue hour, see if there's something that I can come up that I like more. If not, I always have the shot from last night, and if by chance there's something that I see here that I really like, maybe there's the potential to come back another morning. Maybe the morning is actually pretty good, it's just I got beat by the weather this time. So you always have to allow yourself more times to shoot just in case you see some potential. The other thing that might change is if the sun does come up, it'll come up from over there, which means I'll get light on these towers. So this could turn into a pretty nice gold hour. So I know I already have the blue hour that I liked from the night before, so I stay here this morning. Maybe I don't get the blue hour I like, but I might end up with a nice golden hour shot with nice reflections. My camera settings are the same as last night. I'm shooting in aperture priority mode. F8, right now I have exposure times of 6 to 12 to 15 seconds. As the light starts to increase this morning, that shutter speed, since it's in aperture priority mode, is gonna change automatically. So everything's set up, ready to go. I'm gonna wait here, see if things improve as the sun starts to come up. The Merlion statue just turned on, and I actually think there's a Starbucks under that bridge there. So I'm gonna leave everything here, run and get a coffee since I have a few minutes before the blue hour begins. So I've shot all the way through the blue hour. The sun's officially up, though it's complete grayscape right now, so it's hard to tell. We're not actually getting any light from the sun. Let's take a look at the progression of the photos that I captured this morning. But once I thought that I captured the essence of this morning blue hour, I decided to do something a little bit different. Now, this morning I got here and I pretty much copied the same composition that I had last night so that I could show you guys the differences without too much variation. But as the morning progressed, I noticed that the sun was not going to come up. It was just going to stay behind this gray overcast. But I kind of like that gray overcast quality to the sky and the buildings. It created what I consider to be sort of a grayscape. And with really nice soft reflections, I decided to center my horizon so I had a perfect mirror of the towers and the water. And I put on a neutral density filter onto my camera, and I decided to experiment a little bit with long exposures. Now the goal here was really to push the exposures to about 2 minutes so that I could soften out the water. Now last night this would have been impossible to do because the water was so ripply I couldn't see any of the shape of the towers. But since the shape of the towers was already present in the reflections of the water, I knew that I could just push the exposure to about 2 minutes and get a mirrored reflection. Check out the shot I took with my Fujifilm X-T1 and a 10-stop solid neutral density filter. As you can see, everything is completely smooth, and in the process of that 2-minute exposure, I've also smoothed out the sky, so I have very little detail in the sky and almost a perfect mirrored soft reflection of the cityscape. So basically, this shot is pretty boring, but that's exactly why I decided to do a long exposure, just to make it a little bit more interesting. So if it was flat gray, minimal texture and already boring with the reflections, by doing a longer exposure, I could at least turn it into something a little bit more interesting. So where you'd actually see the reflections of something that doesn't look that interesting on top, smoothing it out completely makes it look like a long exposure fine art shot. And centering it gives it an interesting mirrored effect from top to bottom. So with a long exposure and doing something like this, you're able to create something that's a little bit more interesting than it would have been on its own. So again, the conditions aren't that fantastic. I don't think this would really make my portfolio, but it is kind of interesting because it shows the dreary mood that we can have in this part of the world when we have this hazy and humid atmosphere. It's also a nice way to just experiment with options. So you might not like your key shot, but you can go ahead and experiment and try to get something that you might like. You never know what you're going to come up with, so it's always good to experiment. For this shoot this morning, I was really hoping that after the blue hour, the sun would come up and illuminate the building so I could do some more long exposure with that golden light. But the reality is that you can't win them all. Sometimes the weather's going to beat you, so it's good to plan multiple days. But since it's completely overcast now, I don't think the sun's going to come up at all today, or maybe in a few hours. But either way, this shoot is pretty much done for the morning. So through 2 shooting sessions, I've managed to get 3 different shots. Let's take a look at those 3 shots, and then we'll take a look at the post-processing involved. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. This is where we start to have a little bit more fun because we're moving on to cityscape photography. What we've been doing before has been cityscape, but more of a classic old architecture style of cityscape. Now we're moving into the ultra-modern, and it doesn't get more ultra-modern than Singapore. Pretty much every time I visit Singapore, a new structure has gone up, they've changed something, put a new tower up, and even in the shots that we're looking at now, I was there a few months ago, and they've already started to put up new structures and new things. So it's an exciting place to visit because you always get changing structures and new things to photograph. So this is where it's going to bring up some very specific issues that we're going to have to work on. Now think back to Manarola, and remember I had the camera pointed down, so we had a horizon that was up a little bit, and that changed the way that things were distorted by pulling them out, pulling these edges out. Well, now that I'm actually having a little bit less water, so it's like a 60-40 or a 70-30, it's actually causing that distortion so that everything basically bends in. So our lines and our skyscrapers, they're not actually linear, they bend, they warp, it doesn't look right. So we're going to learn some tools inside of Capture One to help fix that and to make sure that the horizontal lines in our buildings are always perfect. So this is the first time we're going to be talking about the blue hour for cityscape specifically. Some of the tools that we've been using so far are going to apply, but we're going to have to use them in a new way. So let's get started. Here we are inside of Capture One. Now, this is basically what I shot. Remember, we shot this at a few times a day. We did morning and night, and then another morning. And this is basically the best shot I got at night. This is shot with a Nikon D810. But in the morning, I never really liked it. It looked flat, but I was able to get this pretty cool long exposure with the Fujifilm X-T1. And it looks like if I read this, this is about a 2-minute exposure, a little bit over 2 minutes. So it's nice, and you can see that I really took advantage of that soft, muted light. So I was able to make a pretty cool comp out of this, and you can see how soft and beautiful that reflection is. This is not the file we're going to work on today. We're actually going to be working on this night shot, which is what I'd go for if I was looking for a portfolio shot of the Singapore Central Business District skyline. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do, though, let's address some of the things that we know we need to address. And the first thing is distortion and light fall off. So if we do that, that's just going to go ahead and clean up any vignetting, and it's also going to fix the distortion from the wide angle lens. We're going to move on now to something that we haven't talked about yet, and that is specifically called keystoning. Keystoning is one of my favorite tools inside of Capture One because it gives you more than just the ability to change sliders. It actually gives you the ability to draw your linear lines, and then it will figure out what is straight and what isn't. Now this is a very big advantage. Now say you just pull a slider and you just start warping your image, so you start stretching everything out and making everything vertical again. Well, what would happen if your horizon was off? And you did that, it wouldn't be perfect. So using keystoning, and using keystoning the way I'm going to show you, allows you to let Capture One figure out how much needs to be fixed by rotation and how much needs to be fixed by actual anti-distortion. Let's take a look at these features. So with keystoning, we can actually very easily change this, the vertical or horizontal distortion, but we have a very specific option here that's a lot of fun. And you see these three tools here. We have keystone vertical, horizontal, and then we have a double keystone here. I'm going to go ahead and click on this, so we're going to go ahead and keystone vertical, and that's going to bring up 4 little points. These points are controlled, so basically what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to find lines close to the edge, and I'm just going to go ahead and quickly draw these right now, and I'm going to zoom in. So basically what I'm going to do here, I'll zoom in so we can see this, is I'm basically going to tell Capture One which lines I need it to correct. So we'll get these really close to the edge, and then when I click on one, I can actually use the arrow keys on the keyboard to basically draw these lines. So basically what I'm doing is just trying to let Capture One know that this line of this building should be a straight line. It should not look like this. If you leave your cityscapes like this, it's kind of a telltale sign that you're an amateur cityscape photographer. Let's see, let's put this up here, and this is going to be very important that this is as close to accurate as possible. You can always clean it up a little bit in Photoshop, but basically we want this to be really accurate. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I'll zoom out here all the way, and I'll click Apply. Perfect. So you can see now that I've clicked Apply, everything looks pretty linear. Actually, it looks near perfect. Any adjustments that you need to make, you can just shift these around a little bit if you were a little off, hit Apply again. But this is actually looking pretty good. I'll zoom in one more time just to see if I missed. Again, it's always important to zoom in because we want to make sure these are as close to perfect as possible. And here you can see that I am actually off a little bit here. Now that I see that line, it should be a little bit closer to the edge here. That looks about right. I'm going to reapply it. And it's just going to reapply that line. Go ahead and slide over to this other one and just double check. It actually looks pretty good. All right, so we've keystoned the image, and now you can see that it's showing me a crop preview. Well, this crop preview is pretty good, but you can see that I'm losing this light right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something a little bit different. I don't want to use the crop result. I actually want to use all of the pixels, and I'm going to do some extra things in Photoshop to try to keep everything intact. So I'm going to say crop outside image, and I'm going to select the crop tool. And we'll say it's unconstrained. And with the crop tool selected, I'm actually just going to slide this up here, and I'm going to slide this over. I basically want to go ahead and bring into Photoshop everything, not just the area that's fixed, but I want these areas that are not fixed either, just in case I want to do any additional adjustment. Here's what's really interesting. In order to get these lines mostly correct, you can see that there was a little bit of rotation applied too. So this was skewed a little bit more than this side. So that tells me that there was a little bit of horizon misleveling as well. So the keystoning was able to figure that out. Now here, since we've done all of this, you can see it's changed all of these options here, very specific options. So what I'm going to do now that I've set the keystoning and I've set the basic settings for each of these, I'm going to copy it here by saying Copy Adjustments, and I'm going to select these two and right-click and say Apply Adjustments. And what that's going to do is that's going to give me 3 identical keystoned images. So it's very important that you make sure that it's correct first, then go ahead and apply it. But now that we've applied it, we can just start doing the normal things that we do inside of here. In this case, I'm going to leave the white balance as shot. It looks pretty good, actually, like the way that it looks. It's very blue, has a little bit of warmth on the inside. We can modify that a little bit in Photoshop. First thing I want to do is address which of these do I want to work as my base image. Well, right off the bat, I really like the water in this one. This is about an, 5-second exposure. And then the -1 exposure here is actually a 2.5-second exposure. But you can see that this is exposed correctly for the highlights, where this, we're starting to blow out some of these areas. And which areas am I specifically talking about? Well, check this out. See that Maybank logo right there? If I go to the other image, you can see the Maybank logo come back, and then a -2 image, you can see the Maybank logo come all the way into it. You can also see this one here, the UOB office here, all of these banks, all of these different straighting, all of these different signs, all of them come to life on an underexposure. So in cityscape photography, it's really interesting. You can nail 99.9% of the shot with one, but then you're going to find yourself needing maybe that -2 or -1 or -2 just to fix these extreme signs. And in Singapore, we also talked a little bit about In the morning, less of these signs are on, so there's less to worry about. But in the morning, there's also less life going on in the city. So it's a give and a take. In this case, I'm going to use this as the base image. I'm going to make some nice, simple adjustments. First thing, I'm going to fix up the shadows here. So I'm going to take the shadows up just a little bit so that I can basically keep this from clipping here on the left. So I just want to bring the shadows up just a little bit, maybe somewhere around 10 or 12, not much. And then I'm going to kind of fix the highlights. Even if I slide this all the way to the right, this is the first time that we've seen the highlights do pretty much nothing. And that's because the only highlights that have a problem here are these extreme areas of highlights. So I'm not going to be able to really fix that here. And the only way that I could really fix it is to turn this all the way up and clamp this down a little bit. But that's not actually going to fix those areas that are blown out. It's just going to make them softer and less bright. So what I'm actually going to have to do is use this as a base exposure, and then we're going to modify this one a little bit, because this one actually has the highlights intact. So we'll say this is our base exposure, so let's go ahead and adjust this a little bit. I'm going to pull the exposure down just a little bit. Pull the highlights and also the shadows, just a little bit. And I'm going to take a look at the highlights between this and this. Pull the shadows down just a little bit more, and pull the exposure down just a little bit more. Basically, what I want to see here is that Maybank logo without being blown out, and I also want to see these a little bit cleaned up. Now that looks pretty good. So here's our base, and here's our highlights. All these little logos are starting to come back to life. So here's what we're going to do. First thing we're going to do is right-click on this one, Export, Variants, and bring it into Photoshop. All right, that looks pretty good. I'll leave that here. You can see that since I've keystoned it, I have all this gray. We'll take care of that in a few minutes. First thing I want to do, I have the original raw here. I'm going to bring that in so that we can start comparing right from the beginning. So we'll go ahead and bring this in here and throw it behind. So you can see after that keystone, it's a very, very big difference between vertical lines being distorted and vertical lines being nice and horizontal like they should be. Let's go back into Capture One, and let's go ahead and export the highlights layer. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and quickly bring this in to the layer above here. So we'll go ahead and bring this in the layer above. So we have, right now, the original raw. We'll call this one the adjusted raw. And we'll call this adjusted highlights. Here's where I'm going to change things up a little bit. We've been using luminosity masking now. We've been creating our own custom highlights maps, shadow maps. We've even been using midtone maps. But now what we're going to do is we're going to compare some different methods for creating different levels of luminosity masks. So I've been using the clamping method, but now I'm going to show you guys the inverse method, and we're going to compare the results here. So the first thing, let's just go ahead and create a luminosity mask right now. So we've done this before. We know that this is our base layer, and then we want the highlights from this layer. So you can see that they're nice and crisp and not blown out. So we go into the channels, Command-click RGB channel, and we just go ahead and create a brand new luminosity mask based on the luminance. So at this point, what I could do is I could apply this to a folder like we usually do, and I could paint in the underexposed areas. But here's the thing. With cityscape photography is a little bit different than the other type of stuff we've been doing in Rome. This is a lot darker than this. So any part of overlap here, you can see that I really like the exposure of this part of the building here. I want it to be bright, but I only want the little highlights, specular highlights, just in this area. So what I'm going to have to do is one of two things. I'm either going to have to clamp this, so I could take this channel, and remember, I can just pull the black over just like this, so I can clamp this channel and create a custom channel so I can try to omit some of this area. Well, that's one way to do it, and 90% of the time, this is the way I do it. But for cityscape photography, there's actually one more way to do it. And if you've ever heard somebody talk about luminosity masking as a sort of a whole technique rather than just a tool, they sell you on trying to use panels that generate 30 or 40 different luminosity masks. So far in this tutorial, we've only generated the ones that we've needed, and to be honest, you rarely need more than 2 or 3, and they're easy to create within just a few seconds. But basically, this is the clamping method. So this is how you just clamp the values. But there's another way to do it. And here's where it gets a little bit confusing, but it's actually not that hard to do. I've already created one highlights. If I were to clamp this, let's go ahead and duplicate it here. If I just duplicate this, bring the curves up with Command M and clamp it, what I'm going to do is create what I call a super highlight selection. So we have all of the highlights, and then we have just a selection of the highlights. But we can do something a little bit different too. If you load the highlights as a selection, and then you invert it, and to invert, you use Command, Shift, Option, and you can see right now I can Shift, I can subtract, and we've been doing that, but if I add all the keys together, Shift, Command, Option, I get an X, and that means invert. If I invert the channel with itself and create a new channel, what that's actually going to do is create super highlights. Every time that you invert this with itself and create a new one, it's going to create more super specular highlights. So it's basically doing the same exact thing as clamping. It's just a slightly more, I wouldn't want to say complex, it's just a different way of working. So let's just compare the two results here. I have my basic highlights here. I have the one that I created first with clamping, and then I have my super highlights that I created with that other method. So you can see they're almost identical. Now, what people say and what I've tested, they say that anti-aliasing stays more intact if you do the inverse method, but all of my tests show that clamping is just as good, especially if you're sort of soft-handed on it. Either way, whether you want to use the inverse method, which I'll be kind of mixing in from now and again, or you want to use the clamping method, the idea basically stays the same. And I'm just going to delete one of them right now. It allows us to compress those highlights and create, instead of just our global highlights, it allows us to create super highlights or compressed clamped highlights. So instead of using this, what we're going to do is select this new super highlights layer that we've created. And I'm going to create a folder here, apply it just like we usually do, and I'm going to go ahead and throw that highlights map in there, and that's the result. So now it's going to be compressed down to just a more specific area. Let's zoom out and take a look at what's actually going on here. So even though we still have a compressed set of highlights, super highlights, whatever you want to call them, we're still getting a lot extra effect on here. Like I don't really want to mess too much with the water. I really don't want to mess too much with these lights. You can see that using luminosity masking is pretty useful, but it also creates some problems. You can see it actually creates some bad luminosity channels here too. So not every light is blown out. There's just specific ones where we want more detail. So even with the super highlights selected, we're still going to have to go in and create a black mask on this layer and just paint in the areas that we want to correct. Now, obviously, that should be a no-brainer on some of them, like this one, like the DBS logo here. We just start to sort of paint that in. You can see that it starts to fix it. It's okay for it to have a little bit of a glow, but you want it to make sure that it's, not so blown out. And in Singapore, there are tons of lights everywhere. And you can see next year in Singapore, there's going to be more towers. So there's going to be even more. The Merlion here, we can kind of fix him up a little bit. He is the mascot of Singapore, so we want to make sure we treat him really well. All of these little things, Merrill Lynch. I know it's funny. It's almost like we're doing these brands a favor, but it looks bad if we don't fix it. It shouldn't be just destroyed. But here's a problem here. If I go too much, I don't actually like that. It's darkening the building, so this UBS logo I'm going to leave as is. This one here, ANZ, or actually, sorry, ANZ, because it's a Australia Pacific Bank. They do Z as Z. Let's see, HSBC. Just going to fix these up just a little bit. Actually, trading looks pretty good. That could use a little bit of work. That could use a little bit of work. Maybank, here's a big one. I don't want that to be blown out. I just want that to be nice and crisp yellow. This one too, One Raffles. It's a very nice building if you guys can ever get access to shoot there. Here's the most important area. So you can see that I'm just cleaning this up. This is super selective work. But in Cityscape, it's one of the big pains of doing this type of work because everything's so close, but the hotter these lights are in the buildings, the more you have to sort of mitigate it. When we were working in Italy, some of it could stay blown out, but to be honest, there was not nearly as much of it. This just is always a constant problem in all of the cityscape photography, especially when you're trying to get that perfect blue hour. The later it gets, the more lights are going to be affected. So some of this stuff we can just kind of clean up a little bit. This logo will probably never be able to get back all the way, but that's okay. It's kind of getting, pretty far off here. Lights look great, a little bit of a starburst. Let's address the water. Looks like the water looks pretty good. If I wanted to, remember, I'm blending in an exposure that was a shorter amount of time, but if I just soften it up a little bit, just a little bit of opacity, just bring down the intensity of some of this water. Sort of soften it up. Some of this down here under the bridge. A little bit of this. That is boat streak. I'm actually going to leave those in. I kind of like the streaky boats. All right, so there we go. Let's go ahead and fix up the Fullerton. If you guys are ever in Singapore, this is a good place right here to get a Singapore sling, which is a famous drink in Singapore. Not the best drink, but it is kind of the thing to do if you visit Singapore. All right, so there we go. So we have a before and after, and again, I know it's not super intense, but to be honest, it's really, really important. I'm just going to go ahead and quick save. While I do this, we're going to call this Super Highlights Luma, just so we can keep things nice and consistent. All right, so now it's time to do a little bit of object cleanup. And I'm just going to do some object cleanup on an extra layer. It's not going to be a lot of this, but I'm going to get rid of a few things like these buoys and markers. So we're just going to use the selective heel brush to get rid of this kind of stuff, clean it up a little bit. I'm going to leave the boats. I like the streaky lights. And here is a situation I can't really use. Well, actually, it worked pretty well. Wow, I'm surprised. Usually this one totally fails, but you can still see that it's left some artifacting. So what I'm going to have to do is use the clone stamp a little bit with a light opacity, and I'm just going to go in and kind of, I'm going to go in and kind of clean this up. We'll make sure that we're on the, we have the right things applied here, aligned, and we'll just go ahead and clean this up a little bit here. I messed that up again. Let's clean that up a little bit. Perfect. Clean it up from here. There we go. Doesn't have to be perfect. I'm not a real big fan of these extra shadows on these lights. So I'm cool with them being there. I just want them to be a little less intense. There we go. Zoom out. There's a little bit of cleanup. I bet there's going to be some cleanup to do here in the sky. There are a few spots that we can get rid of. Once I take the sky a little bit further, we're going to be adding some tonal contrast here. It's not a cloudless night, so it's not quite as bad as a blue sky. I remember in the video I was a little disappointed with the weather, but to be honest, I think we can pull something out of this, and that's what we're going to try to do. And at this point, I'll go ahead and take a look here. Our lines are very close to perfect. You can see that's not exactly right. You can see I'm still a little bit off. So what I'm going to do is pull up some lines, pull the rulers up here, and you can see that we're so close on that. And then even here, all the way over here, we're so close. I'm just going to go ahead and throw everything into a folder real quick, zoom out one level, and do a transform. And I'm actually just going to go ahead and skew this out just a little bit more just to fix that. So if your keystoning wasn't exactly right, now's your chance to go in and make it exactly right. So that looks much better now. That looks much better now. Zoom out one more step and apply that. Good. Let's hide the guides real quick. So here's where it gets a little bit interesting. Let's play around with some cropping options. So right now, I went out of my way inside of Capture One to make sure I could keep everything, because I want to go ahead and crop the least amount possible. But we know, set this back to original ratio and clear it, we know that we're going to have to lose a little bit of the sky. That's fine. I'm totally cool with that. We're going to have to lose a little bit of the water. That's fine. I'm totally cool with that too. Here's the problem. If I crop here, I don't want to lose that light. I actually want that light to be in the scene. So what I'm going to do is crop outside to where I'd actually like to crop this bridge, which would probably be right around here. So that's where I'm going to crop. And on this side, if I crop all the way to the water, look what happens. We're really close to that building. I actually just want to be a little bit further away. So that's going to sort of be a comfort zone. With cityscape photography, I don't like to cut it off where there's a building. I like to have a little bit of space. So this gives me a little bit of space. And in fact, I can probably go a little bit further. And I'll apply this crop. So that actually looks pretty good. All right, so here's the problem. We have a little bit of area missing. So now that I've created my own custom crop, not based on what it wanted to crop, here's what I'm going to have to do. And this is actually, believe it or not, this is something that I've been using for years, and it's kind of a little trick of mine to be able to fix areas. So let's say right now we're going to add some water where there wasn't any water, but let's say we had sky. There's the opposite effect of this, and we had to put more sky in. Here's the easiest way to do it. First thing I'm going to need is a clean layer, so I'm going to say Shift, Option, Command, E. That's going to give me a clean layer. What I'm going to do is zoom in here. I'm going to make a selection around the water, just like this. And I'm going to use Command J to make it a new layer. I'm going to use Command T to transform it. Now instead of doing this, what I'm going to do is something a little bit different. Right-click this and say Warp. And now I'm just going to pull this edge down, and I'm going to go ahead and warp out the water just a little bit. And I'm just going to create this custom warp for the water. So I was able to just stretch what was already there, so you can see from here to here. Water and sky, nobody ever notices you do this. I'm going to merge this with the layer underneath. Or actually, you know what? I'm just going to leave it up top. And I'm going to go all the way to the right side. I'm going to do the same thing. This is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to grab the marquee around here first. I do not want to stretch that blue light. I'm going to do the same thing. Command J to duplicate, Command T to transform, right-click, and warp. And the first thing I'm going to do is warp this out here. That looks great. What I'm going to do now is bake this into the layer underneath. So merge it, Command E merges it down. And I'm going to do this one more time. And I'm just going to grab all of this water without that shadow there. I can just grab as much as I want. Command J, transform, warp, and I'm going to do this one more time. Cool thing is you can just go ahead and create these custom warps. It's water, it's reflections, nobody ever notices. And now I ended up with these two layers here. But what I'm going to do is delete the utility layer that I created, and I'm just going to basically merge these two together here. And I'm just going to put them right inside of that group. So we'll just call this water patch. And we'll call this one cleanup. And that's perfect. Let's go ahead and zoom out and take a look at the result. Zoom out one more time, make it a little bit easier to see. What we've gone from here, it's going to look a little funny, our original raw, which is very distorted, to our blended result, which is on its way to looking much, much better. Now it's time to start processing it. But before we move on, by zooming out, I can see that I've made a tiny little mistake here, and that's okay. I'm just going to correct that really quick. Sometimes I get a little ahead of myself, but again, that's no big deal. We'll just go ahead and clone this in. Easy. That's why I always check. Sometimes I get kind of caught up in the moment, ready to move on, kind of in a hurry to see what the final image is going to look like, and I don't think too much about what I'm working on, and then I merge everything down without actually thinking about it. So that's fixed there, and our verticals are perfect. Everything looks good. Let's go ahead and take this. I'm going to create a new layer, Shift Option Command E, and in the process get some nice finger exercise. I'm going to go up to Filter, and for this one, I think we're going to use Knit Collection, but we could use On One as well, because all I really want to do is add a little bit of tonal contrast with Color Effects Pro. All right, let's maximize this, make it a little easier to see. Pro contrast, here's what I'm going to do. Let's add some dynamic contrast. Let's really push those values a little bit. What I want to do to be careful, though, as I do this, I want to protect the highlights. I want to make sure that I don't blow out those highlights. I've been very careful to protect. And the shadows, I want to be careful that I don't compress the shadows too much. Let's just go ahead and make some adjustments. I have a feeling that if I correct color cast, it's going to start to turn the image a little bit warmer, which I do not want. In this case, I want to take advantage of the blue hour, and I like the warmth against the blue, so I really don't want to mess with the color too much right now. I just want to get a good amount of contrast. But let's take a look at this. So I really like what it's doing. I love the way it's chiseling out the buildings, but I really can't stand what it's doing to the water. So here's where I can do a couple different things. I could either use the U points to get rid of this, or I could apply it, mask it out. In this case, I'm just going to really quickly set a couple of U points here. Should be really easy to just go ahead and get rid of most of that water. I'll set some positive viewpoints just so that I can keep the buildings and everything else. and that should look pretty good if we turn this on and off. And it looks like we're going to have to add a few more negative viewpoints just to make sure that we don't have any problems. Now, sometimes this may seem like a lot of viewpoints, and anytime that it does, like even now, I'm getting this great effect on top, but I really don't like that it's still doing the water. So in this case, I'm actually going to turn this Pro Contrast off. I'm going to reset it by adding another filter really quick. Let's just say Pro Contrast. I'm going to do the same thing that I did before. Nice dynamic contrast, nice correct contrast. We're going to get that look that we want. And I'm only going to concern myself with the top portion of the image. We'll go ahead and clamp the highlights and shadows a little bit just so we can get something nice. And I'm going to apply it. With this new result, let's create a mask. Use the gradient tool here from white to black. We'll just go ahead and have it fade off till about there. So we have this. Looks great. Merge this down, Command E. Let's go back into Color Effects Pro. That's just an easier way to do things. Here we are again. I'm going to add a little bit of dynamic contrast here to the image. Make sure that it's toggled on here. And I only want that here in the sky, very specifically in a couple areas of the sky where I want it to show that there's some contrast here. So we'll take a look at a quick before and after. That's starting to look pretty good. I'm going to add a tonal contrast, and that's going to start to pop the details of the sky. It's also doing a lot of negative things, so first thing we need to do is go ahead and lock it down to the areas that we want it to exist. Just a few areas here. We want all that contrast. And now, it's very dramatic, so we'll start to tone it down. Don't need the highlights. Usually everything happens in the midtones, so we'll do somewhere around 18 and 20%, just so we can get that. Now, I'm also going to start removing it from some of these towers, just because I don't want them to be too dramatic. So this is a good example of, you know what, it's a less than inspiring sky, but it still has some nice texture. So we can go ahead and take advantage of that texture just by making a few little adjustments. That looks pretty good. Apply that, and that should just be tonal contrast in the sky. Let's take a look at the result here. You can see that now we've added a lot more drama to the sky. So it is a very odd sky that's going on right here. We have these clouds, it's kind of rain, kind of haze, kind of humidity, very typical Singapore mixed, cloudy, mixed, overcast, mixed, equatorial living kind of sky. But we were able to give it a little bit more life with tonal contrast. Overall, this is looking pretty good, but the problem is anything you do to the sky causes us to be able to see all the problems with the sky. In this case, we'll always get that extra sensor dust, so it's just more sensor dust to remove, basically. And let's see, it's just kind of something you get used to doing. In a sky like this, it's probably more important because we do have some kind of bluish areas. So any flat color, flat tone stuff, you're really going to notice these. If the sky was just dramatic, which I really hoped for, and I hope when you guys are in Singapore, visiting Singapore, you get the dramatic skies. In Asia, they usually call them burning skies, and it's amazing when you actually catch those in Singapore. But even this sky is still usable. I do kind of like it. So we basically have our CEP Color Effects Pro, we'll just call this contrast, and then we have our CEP tonal contrast layer. And those look pretty good so far. The next thing that we can kind of address is just some of the overall luminosity here. Now, I do reference the histogram. I am looking at it here, especially in the studio because I'm under really hot light, so I want to make sure that I'm not clipping anything out. Now, I am clipping things on the right side. Here's a really useful trick, actually. If you want to see what you're clipping inside of Photoshop, we've done this in different applications, but not Photoshop. If you just load curves, not an adjustment layer, just load curves on a scene, you can show clipping. And when you show clipping, you'll actually be able to see, like right now I actually don't have much clipping, but if I start to move this over, you can see those areas that are clipped. So it should be pretty obvious. And the more I move this over, you can see that those lights start to come in. So the clipping that's happening, very minimal here, not too much. In the shadows, there's actually very little clipping. We're doing really good as far as a histogram adjustment goes. But what I want to do is kind of, I want to mess with some of the tones here. I'm going to get this just right. So let's go ahead and create a mid-tone mask. So I want to move the midtones. And you can see here we have a lot of shadows. Kind of starting to get into the quarter tones, but our midtones are kind of flat. I want to go ahead and try to boost the midtones a little bit and leaving the highlights alone. Go back to the channels. We already have this layer. Let's get rid of some of these. If you are working and creating luminosity masks, it's a good idea to delete them all if you're not using them. If you're using one of those panels that creates a million of them for no reason, bear in mind that it's just going to get cluttered here. A lot of people think that they need a lot of luminosity masking, but they really don't. They need one or two things. And all of the stuff that I use, I just create them on my own because it only takes a few seconds. You don't need an application to take care of it for you. So remember, the midtones one's pretty cool. We're just going to go ahead and create one where we can go ahead and duplicate it, actually, and invert it. Whoops, actually, I can't do that without deselecting it first. So we'll go ahead and invert it here. So we have shadows, highlights. Let's select all, Command all, and we'll just go ahead and remove highlights. And we'll remove the shadows. Photoshop's going to get very angry at us because it says it cannot actually create crawling ants, but we'll just go ahead and create curves here. And our curves, you can see this looks really, really flat. I mean, there's nothing but the midtones, and we know we don't have that much as far as the midtones are concerned. So what we're actually going to do is go into the curves, and you can see usually what I've been doing, you guys have seen me kind of create more contrast. Well, I don't want more contrast. I actually want more gamma. So when you say gamma boost, this is a gamma boost. So if I bring the midtones up, and let's change this back to our RGB. If I bring the midtones down, you can see how that's shifting that over, but if I bring the midtones up, you can see it's shifting it over to the right. Now I don't want to go too high, but if I go a little bit higher, it's actually just going to bring those midtones up. You can change the whole tonality of my scene a little bit. It's going to give me more luminance overall, but it's not going to blow out any highlights. It's just going to put everything around those highlights and shadows. So that's basically what I call a gamma boost. It's pretty easy to do. Next thing that I can do to try to pull this over a little bit more, I can go back to our highlights channel, or actually our shadow map here, and I can select the shadows, go back to the layers, and do another curve. And this allows me to basically select all the shadows, omit just the highlights, and I can actually pull this over just a little bit. And that'll brighten up basically everything. And I can be very careful to just get those highlights or shadows up a little bit and keep full control over everything. So it just allows me a little bit more of a bump in sort of the vibrance. The other thing that I can do is I can create a little bit more contrast down there just with a brightness and contrast channel, and I can create some more sort of contrast to pull all that in and unify it all together. So that's starting to look pretty good, actually. And the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and do some sharpening on this image. And we have some options for what we can do here, but what I'm going to use is just a high-pass filter. We could, if we wanted to, we could actually use, under Nik Collection, we could use Sharpener Pro, but I feel like with this scene, I think that high-pass filter is going to do the best job. I'll duplicate one of these layers, go under Filter, Other, High Pass. And I have it set to 2.5. I'm going to set it to 3 because this is 36 megapixels, and we're just going to go ahead and set this to be overlay. We know we don't want this in the water. We know we don't want this in the sky. So what we're actually going to do now, and this is where it gets a little bit difficult, if we just wanted to try to have this exist inside of the skyline, we'd actually have to do a little bit of masking around the building. So what I'm going to do is split the difference. I'm going to go ahead and put a mask on this. And what I'll do here is with the gradient tool from black to white, I'll just go ahead and say that I want it to start getting sharp around here. And actually I'll invert that because I did it wrong. And you can see here, we're masking out most of the sky. So with quick mask selected, I'm basically just going to try to get some or just a little bit of that out. So I basically want most of the buildings to be sharp, and I'm just going to manually kind of paint out the rest. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's sharpening on a different layer, so, you know, and actually this is perfectly acceptable. If you were going to print, I'd suggest working a little bit more on it than this, just trying to get it a little bit closer. But all these areas down here, let's just say all down here, we know we don't want that to be sharp. Just the skyline. Very simple. Just like that. Just like that. And now we have sharpening. So we'll call this high pass. 3 pixels. Now let's take a look at everything that we've done so far. So what I'd like to do is take us back to the beginning here. This is our original raw. You can see that it's offset a little bit because we've done the distortion, but you can see it looks pretty good, you know. It's got some nice shadows. It has potential, very flat sky, but it's very distorted. It's distorted because we didn't use a tilt shift lens. I rarely use one because they don't really make one that's wide enough. They don't make a 14 millimeter tilt shift lens. Even a 17 sometimes is just not wide enough. Nikon actually makes a 24, but 24 isn't wide enough for any kind of architectural photography that involves skylines. So what I actually have to do is usually account for this being, I'd say max, and we talk about this before in the video series, about 70-30 or 60-40 skylines. So you can see that after the distortion, we've actually been able to adjust it so that everything is basically linear. And then we were able to blend everything together and get something that's a little bit more just vibrant, poppy, and alive. So it's a good start. It's a good way to get started on this kind of cityscape photography. So very often when you look through the back of your LCD or through your viewfinder, you're not really going to like what you see because it's so contrasty with the different darkness of the buildings and the lights, with this kind of like a lackluster sky, nothing that has too much tonality. So expect sometimes with these types of scenes, especially with this kind of sky, you have to put a little bit more work into it with some extra tonal contrast just to kind of bring everything alive again. All right, so that wraps up the Singapore skyline. I'll see you guys next time in the studio.